So I'm very excited to be joined by Dr. Lucrecia Grandolini for this Leading Thought special conversation. Lucrecia is an organizational psychologist, former global head of L&D at Investec, and now a leadership consultant, speaker, and author. Her work sits at the intersection of leadership, organizational change, and human psychology. And she has recently co-authored Leading with Human Skills with Professor Nick Van Dam and others, and contributed to the book Leaders as Architects of Change, which was edited by the University of Pennsylvania's Chief Learning Officer program. So, Lucrecia, welcome to my virtual living room, and thank you so much for agreeing to join me for this special conversation.
Thank you. It's my pleasure to be here with you today.
Great, great. So, how are you feeling today? All good?
All good. Sunny day in London.
Yeah.
It feels spring is in the air. So, yeah, very good. Very excited about this conversation.
Great, likewise. And there's so much to cover in our conversation. And I think the topic around leadership, what it means to be human, these are so critical at this time. But to get started,
Hmm.
I did want to ask you if you can help us sort of make sense of your own career so far. And I'm very keen to understand what sits at the heart of the work that you do.
Hmm. Wow, great question. So by background, I'm an organizational psychologist, but I actually started as a clinical therapist working with children in shanty towns in Buenos Aires, Argentina, where I'm from. And after a while of working there, even though it obviously was very meaningful, and I would like to think that I was helping these children, I became a bit preoccupied with the thought that even though I was helping the individual, they were part of a system that was dysfunctional, that was corrupted. Essentially, what I was observing was that, the mothers were getting pregnant so they could receive support, financial support from the government. And in a way, I felt, I was colluding, with this reality. So then I became more interested in how can we change systems, not just help individuals. And therefore, I decided to pursue my master's at London School of Economics around social and organizational psychology, would basically broaden my lens from the individual to what happens when individuals are in groups and what happens when we are in institutions and organizations. So that broadened my perspective into, system psychology and organizational psychology. Then I transitioned to management consulting, very, very different context. I had the privilege of working in many different countries with many different teams. But after a while, I felt I was distant of the psychology. I was a bit, I was working with things related to, human capital, but I would say I was more on the capital than on the human, if that makes any sense. So I then sort of took a very interesting role in a financial institution as an organizational psychologist, essentially working with teams, consulting to strategy, consulting to culture, and so on. And after a while, I had the privilege of starting the learning function there. Long story short, I built learning function in this organization, and then later I became the global head of learning and development for this bank. So, for at many points in my career, I thought, things weren't actually connected, but, I think it's true that things, connect when you look at the past, right? Looking behind, I can see a common thread about change, about human psychology, and about leadership, right? As the fastest way to basically impact or influence change. So I think those are the golden threads throughout my career. I pursue many studies. I'm a sort of avid learner. And yeah, that's, how I guess I find myself in this career path nowadays.
Wow, I love it because I mean, it's interesting how when you ask that question, so many different layers come out.
Hmm.
And I love your specific focus around systems and around the human and
Hmm.
how you realize those two things at different points in time. And
Hmm.
I guess how that happened over time
Hmm.
as well. And some of those threads, I think, are really relevant in what's sort of happening at the moment and how we talk about what it means to be human.
Hmm.
Um, so thank you for that.
Hmm.
And I'm sure there's a lot more to sort of to unpack. But that with that in mind, then so the two books that you've contributed to, Leading with Human Skills and Leaders as Architects of Change, feel incredibly relevant
Hmm.
at this time, as we said. But was there a moment or an insight that convinced you that this was the right time
Yes.
to be focused on these topics?
Yeah, so interestingly, and I have them here. So, leading with human skills, thriving in the age of AI. I'll share a big disclosure here. When we started this book, it was actually going to be a completely different book. We were going to talk about some of the common themes that we were actually, touching in this, last edition, but we were going in a different direction. And then we all the co-authors that work in different, you are actually all, distributed around the globe. We are all in different countries from, Panama to Amsterdam to Spain to the US, to London, where I'm based. We started noticing this thing about AI. And this was, actually now 3 years ago. So we weren't sure, is this a big thing? Is it not? Is this a fad, a trend that's going to go away? Um, and I think that we had the intuition that actually this is a paradigm shift. This is actually something that is going to challenge and change how we think about work, workplaces, but also question what it means to be human. So we actually decided to pivot on the spot and change the topic of our book, which I think is a bit of testament about, living and leading in the times of, rapid change and uncertainty we find ourselves in, where, you start with a direction in mind and you have to be sort of constantly scanning the horizon to look at these signs and then, being able to react to that and respond. So so that was a bit of the genesis of the book. We did lots of research. We spoke with recruiters, senior leaders, executives. We also, did research on the most sort of thought-leading papers around the world, from Work Economic Forum to McKinsey to Deloitte, to the Institute of the Future, Future Studies, and together with also business schools, and sort of exploring what are business schools currently teaching students, so from Harvard, INSEAD, you name it. So of all the research, we were able to spot 50 different skills from which we then clustered into 14 different chapters. So the book is really about, what are the skills that we need to develop in order to, remain deeply human in the age of AI. Um, the other book, which I also have here, Leaders as Architects of Change, basically, I was very grateful because this was an invitation to share my findings of my doctoral research. So I studied how senior leaders navigate uncertainty in knowledge sort of working organizations. And, this was an invitation to, share my findings from a scholar practitioner. So not just academically, but also as a leader, in a business, what it means to design and lead organizations in, such a sort of times of change and volatility. So these are the book connects more around how can we lead and design organizations in times of change and uncertainty. So the two books are related, but also they address sort of, interrelated but separate topics.
Yeah, and thank you for that. And also, I suppose in terms of timing, there couldn't be better timing
Yes.
for these topics to be tackled. So as you say, they're sort of that's separate but also interrelated. So I guess if we take the book on leading with human skills,
Hmm.
and the whole idea of what's important, what's relevant, I believe there was a sort of I thought I saw a comment that was about as machines get better at being machines, humans need to get better at being humans. So what underpins that approach that's described in the book?
Yes, thank you. I think that's, yeah, a bit of the premise of the book. I think that basically what we propose is that, with AI being able to automate and augment most of the work we currently been doing, there would be an increasing need to even be, more human in the workplace. I think that we still have some unlearning to do from the Industrial Revolution times, where, the humans and the work was designed as machine, the big metaphor of, being as efficient as a machine, as a well-oiled machine. And we currently still use that metaphor in the workplace, right? But, AI provides us with this opportunity to really, rethink what is work, what is valuable work, and therefore also, what should remain deeply human. And given that, what are the skills we need? So we touch on things like trust, like practical wisdom, like, system thinking, critical thinking, and many other skills that, we think that some part of the skill may be replaced by AI, but there's a part of those skills and mindsets that actually are deeply human, and we actually need to double down on them. And that's what we explore in the different chapters. So it's a very practical book. We also provide resources and, lots of examples and practical tips of how you develop these different skills.
And so yeah, so on that note then, in terms of how do you to your earlier point, in fact, around sort of systems,
Mm-hmm.
organizations are systems and humans within them, are expected to perform in different ways. So what does that then more practically, what does that mean? In terms of the insights that we have from the book. What does it mean in practice?
Mm-hmm. So I mean, there are many things I would say right around that. Perhaps one of the interesting one is around the importance of human connection.
Mhm.
And for instance, if you also follow, the coaching industry, right? There's a lot of talk around AI, being able to coach individuals. A lot of, talk in the L&D industry around, AI chatbots also being able to, provide a very personalized type of learning for people. But I think that, sometimes there's a risk that we're confusing or conflating two different concepts. On the one hand, there's the real, authentic human connection. And on the other hand, is the very efficient, very accurate communication. And let me give you an example, and we share this in the book as well. There's a fantastic movie called Her. I don't know if you watch it.
Mm,
It's
mm,
released around 2013, if I'm not mistaken. It basically follows the life of this lonely writer that is, starred by Joaquin Phoenix, who develops this romantic relationship with this AI companion called Samantha, voiced by Scarlett Johansson.
mm.
And I remember watching this movie back in the days, and I thought, wow, that's a bit futuristic, right? A bit far-fetched, something that is comfortably parked in the distant future, right? And there will be decades or even centuries until we get there. Today, having watched the movie a few months ago, I would say something felt deeply, even disturbing about the movie, right? It feels much closer to home.
Mm.
And it really questions this idea of what is real, authentic human connection versus what I would call communication, but not connection. So, I started sort of pondering around this question because it was a bit, it was bothering me. And one of the things that I started noticing is that, and that's also why, interestingly, TechCrunch has said that the AI companions from between 2022 to 2025, the AI companion industry has grown 700%. Um, because we're also experiencing, this pandemic or epidemic of loneliness and isolation. The World Health Organization has said that, a while ago. So on the one hand, we have this new technology that, guarantees this, immediate response is always there for you, right? Providing reassurance, well done, good job, right? Almost instant attention. They don't get distracted. They don't have to have a break. They're always there for you. So there's something deeply seductive about that, right? Yet at the same time, even though we've never been as connected, as digitally connected in the world before, we're experiencing this loneliness everywhere, right? And Gallup has done research on this, and in the US, 1 out of 5 employees has reported, a sense of feeling lonely at work. So we're in this sort of paradox where we have this ability to have these digital connections everywhere, these AI chatbots that mimic these authentic connections, yet we still feel lonely. And why? The reason is that real human connection are something different from us. If you think about it, when we are in connection, in relation with someone, even as a coworker or a partner or a friend, something is at stake, whether it's our own reputation, whether it has to do with our sense of belonging, whether it has to do with trust, whatever the thing is, there's something at stake. That's why relationships feel a bit edgy, right? And there's also something that we give, but also something that we expect to receive. There's reciprocity.
Mm.
Whereas if you think about AIs, right, there's no reciprocity. Nothing is at stake. It's a closed loop. And more importantly, human relationship, human connection is deeply imperfect,
Mm.
right? If you think about it, right? One day we wake up and maybe, we are in a bit of a mood. Another day something else has gone in our house, or we show up to work a bit differently, right? Human behavior is, unpredictable.
Mm.
Whereas, machines are intrinsically predictable, right? Especially large, language models, they're built on this notion of predictability. So in a real human connection, there's a level of friction, right? I don't
Mm.
know what to expect. It may be good, it may be bad. I'm not sure what this is going to lead to. There's tension. There's something is at stake. And sometimes we also have conflict, right? But that's exactly what makes a human relationship authentic, and even I would argue stronger. It's almost until, you don't have your big fight or you don't have an argument with someone that you can test the strength of that relationship.
Mm.
So that imperfection, which is highly inefficient in a way, is what makes a human connection real. So that's one of the points that we argue in the book.
So, I mean, this is fascinating to me because I think what you've painted there is a picture of the complexity of human beings. And by the way, I did watch the film back when it came out, and it was a fascinating utopian at the time, felt like a utopian dystopian view of whereas now it is happening in a way, but. So the fascinating thing to me from what you just said is how even though there is that level of human complexity if you open your eyes and have a look at that. At the same time, we build organizations over the majority of the 21st century that reduced for efficiency, that reduced that complexity to something sort of to be controlled, to be managed. My own profession talks about resources, human capital, of course, as well, but also resources. So I just wanted to go back then and ask you, what is it then that we need to unlearn
Mhm. Mhm.
within organizations as we're navigating this current phase, and as we are sort of focused on the consequences of what's happening and the implications for human connection?
That's excellent question. So as you rightly pointed out, right, most of our organizational thinking, design, premise is still built around the Industrial Revolution, right? Building machines or building organizations as machines, right? It's all about, input, controlling the output, it's about measurement, it's about, efficiency and productivity at all costs. However, that worked a few years ago, a few, decades ago when the world was, more predictable, where the pace of change was lower, where things were much more linear in a way. However, the limitations of that paradigm are becoming quite evident nowadays, right? We've all seen that where, after months of perhaps working on a paper, you publish it and then it becomes, irrelevant the moment you publish it. Or, you work in this, beautiful project plan. And again, the moment that it's ready to go, there's a change in priorities, or a reshuffle, or a reorg, and all of a sudden you have to go back to the drawing board. Or, you see middle managers, in my work with leaders, you see that all the time where they're expecting full clarity, which never really arrives. They're expecting this grand reveal of the strategy. And when that happens, this fantasy that all of us, we will now understand and know where to go. But that never happens, right? So I think that we are experiencing the limitations of this paradigm that for so long we have hold to, mostly because it worked, and produced results. So we have to rethink organizations and leadership, in this world of constant change, right, where we don't see uncertainty as a disruption, as a moment in time, something that like a storm that we're having to endure, and then the sun will come out again. It's now part of the fabric, it's part of the landscape. So I think we have a unique opportunity and invitation to rethink how do we build organizations and how do we rethink leadership for constant change and adaptation. And therefore, I think that it goes back to one, unlearning a bit of these premises that we still hold very dearly from the Industrial Revolution, even questioning the language we use. We know we still use managers all the time. As you may know, managers, the word manager comes from maneggiare, from Italian, which means, driving a horse, which means, it has to, the essence of the word manager sits the word control and direction, right? Um, and we still use that all the time. So, I would like to think that with this change of paradigm, with all of this, AI revolution that we're currently experiencing, we can evolve some of our own thinking, and including the language that we use. So I think there's some unlearning to do, but there's also some new learning that we need to do that will require new thinking, not just repackaging, the old thinking from before, but actually having a true generative way of approaching, the type of challenges we're facing, which are unprecedented.
Yeah, no, so that's great. And I think in the book, if I'm not mistaken, you talk about a framework. You offer a framework to help us sort of maybe think about sort of humans differently,
Mhm.
and perhaps help us to unlearn
Mhm.
some of the ways in which we sort of have managed humans, in our recent in recent years. So, do you want to talk us through those? I think it's four aspects of the
Mhm.
framework that's covered in the book.
Yes, sure. So one of the things, when I speak about leading through uncertainty, and this comes from my research from my doctorate, the leaders that were really good, not just at navigating and surviving uncertainty, but actually using uncertainty as a strategic asset
Mhm,
for growth, for innovation, for new learning. They actually displayed these four practices.
mhm,
The first one has to do with being comfortable with not knowing. And again, this requires unlearning.
mhm,
We are from even a schooling system, right? We are rewarded for having the right answer, not the right question, but the right answer. And again, we then go to university, we then, become managers, and we are constantly being rewarded for certainty, for having the answers. However, in a world again of uncertainty and unpredictability, the question is more important than the answer, right? So, one of the learnings we have to do is this push and drive to always have the answer all the time, right? So, sitting in this space of discomfort, which, when we don't know, but not as a weakness, but actually as a strategy to invite curiosity, to invite further exploration, to invite inquiry. So that is one of the practices that these leaders display. They were comfortable with not knowing and saying that aloud, which obviously is connected with curiosity. The other thing has to do with trust. In highly volatile environments, people are not just looking for the answers, they're actually looking for a safe space. They're actually thinking, can I trust you? I'm not sure where we're going, but can I trust the person that is leading us or beside me? So
mhm,
trust becomes a buffer for uncertainty. And as we know, trust is also obviously very linked with psychological safety, that, is one of the key cornerstones for adaptability, learning, exploration, innovation, and all the things we need in order for organizations to remain competitive
mhm,
in this type of constant changing world. So, trust, not knowing. And, there are two other things that have to do more with not just how the leader, shows up, but also how they engage with others. One has to do with generative dialogue. This
mhm,
means that, and we see this all the time. We go to a meeting and we already have the answer or what is going to be discussed in the meeting, right? We actually are just exchanging arguments, right? We're actually not thinking together. We're not coming up with new knowledge. A beautiful definition of dialogue by Isaac Newton is this ability to think together. So, leaders that are great at doing this are able to, create not just a discussion, but a dialogue where everyone has a say. So they invite dissent, they invite alternative viewpoints, they make sure that everyone can voice their opinions.
mhm,
Because when we face complex problems, no one has the answer really. Each of us hold like a little piece of the puzzle. So dialogue is how we bring all the pieces of the puzzle together. So, and the last one has to do with presence. And that
mhm,
is, not just obviously being physically present, but mostly being emotionally available, being able to remain grounded where everything around us is shifting. And this also has to do with being having a high capacity for self-regulation,
mhm,
emotional self-regulation, and also to stay with the here and now, not what we think is going to happen, not what happened yesterday, but really being able to face what is happening in front of us. So that ability to being present and being able to name what is true and what is not true, but perhaps we will know later. becomes really important, as a leadership practice
Mhm.
when navigating uncertainty with others. So those are the four practices that, I discuss in the book.
Yeah, I mean that's really great. And so I will
Mm.
ask you to put your practitioner's hat on
Yes.
now and just give us a sense of what if you were in that sort of environment trying to adopt this approach to leadership development, what are the kinds of things that for you would be most needed to focus on, and what are some of the I suppose some of the evidence of this working, and what is it that when we see the impact on performance, what would that look like? And if you have any examples from your own
Yes.
experiences.
And you say that in terms of sort of developing leadership skills, or more of me as a leader, or both?
I think both. Both.
Okay. Okay. So yeah, I think that in practical terms, is perhaps it's not like a big change, what I'm suggesting, it's like micro moments when perhaps rather than to jump into, an answer, you just create some silence, or you invite, the perspective of someone else, you know, or, rather than, going with the heat of things and, going from meeting to meeting, where perhaps on one meeting you're discussing, perhaps with the HR business partner, a restructuring of your team, and then you go next meeting immediately, you have your team meeting, and, being more aware
Mm,
of how we carry ourselves, but also the type of things or practices we need as leaders to self-regulate.
mm,
I've been myself, a leader of teams, and, unfortunately, as many leaders, for instance, had to restructure and move roles from countries, from one country to the other, had to say goodbye to very dear colleagues, and it's extremely difficult, extremely difficult.
mm,
And I would say that at those difficult moments, it's not the perfect plan that, brings people together. It's not the, effective, perfect execution. It's actually the trust of, those long-standing relationships that you build in all the moments, all the months, all even years or decades of working with those people. So I think there's something around just, being aware of how we show up every single day. For instance, how the trust will compound through these micro moments of, engaging, being authentic, leaning into the difficult conversation rather than, being vague when it would be much easier, you know, all of this awareness, at the end of the day, when we are facing things as difficult processes as restructure, they play out. So, I don't have the perfect answer, and I don't think that it's about, the perfect formula anyway. I think it's about, having more awareness of how we show up every single day. And, what's also happening inside of us in the work around uncertainty. I sort of speak a lot, and I also write around, the way we will manage the external uncertainty partially will be a function of how we manage our own uncertainty. So how
mm,
aware are we of how do we respond to that? Do we go into anxiety and start, worrying and cannot sleep? Do we go into action and all of a sudden we become the firefighter trying to fix everything? Do we go into wanting to be the rescuer and,
mm.
becoming, playing the role of the therapist with all our colleagues? What is the role that we tend to take up when these things happened to us? So it's not about labeling, but it's about creating more awareness again of how we show up. And therefore, we can do something about that.
This is so interesting because it's also about, on the one hand, it's also the smaller things.
Mm-hmm.
A lot of the conversations sometimes around leadership and around leadership development are perhaps, a bit broader and a bit
Mm-hmm.
more theoretical, but actually a lot of practical small things that leaders could do. And on the other hand, also about our own self-awareness, our own sort of human, um, uh, understanding of how we react. And I know that. I know we are sort of coming close to the end of the conversation, but I didn't want to miss the opportunity to talk about, just briefly on your reflections on human development and how you see human development at this time, and what are those kinds of elements that we need to be very aware of at the workplace in organizations at the moment.
Mm-hmm. Um, so a bit connected to what we were discussing before, I think that there's some learning that needs to happen when it comes to human development. I, I still, if you look around, most organizations still have followed, the schooling system when it comes to development or learning, right? You have programs, sometimes the programs are tailored to which level of the organization you're at. In my experience, when I was in a big four consulting firm, your career path was exactly connected to your learning path. So if you
Mhm.
wanted to go from senior, consultant to manager, these were the type of courses you had to take. These were the type of experiences you had to take. So you didn't have to do any thinking on your own, basically. The career path was set out for you. You just needed to obey and comply and be disciplined, and then if you follow the path, hopefully the promotion would come associated with that. The problem is that, that linearity, as we were saying, no longer matches the experience, the reality of leading in the world that we we are, right? So, I don't think it's about offering new programs or more programs. Actually, I think that the problem has to do with the whole concept of program, right? I think it's about rethinking work and rethinking organizations. So we design uncertainty with it, not despite it, or not, try to remove it at all cost. So let me
Mm.
give you an example. There's a very interesting study around two different financial institutions. One that reduced uncertainty in every possible way, including how they develop people. Very similar to the Big Four experience I had.
Mhm.
This is what you have to go. These are the programs at your level. This is when you have to do them. So you had all the answers were set out for you, right? You have this onboarding program. So when you're a new joiner, this is exactly what you need to know, and so on and so forth. So people in that organization were extremely competent. They had deep expertise. However, in the long run, they didn't outperform this other organization that had the opposite strategy. The other financial institution, which is one of the most successful banks in the world, maximized uncertainty. So when you joined the organization, there was no onboarding program. Basically, the advice was you have to go and talk to as many people as you can. You have to go and network. You have to go and find your answers. So people were very stressed out, and obviously it felt as a very overwhelming and chaotic experience. But if they were able to thrive in that, after a few months, they had much more connectivity, much more access to the entire knowledge of the organization because they had been networking, they had
Mhm.
been connecting with so many colleagues. Then the other thing is that, there was no program set for them. They had to basically, drive their own paths, which meant that they were much more malleable and adaptable to
Mhm.
what they wanted to do, their own passions, but also what the organization needed. So, and there are many examples of practices the organization was building in a very deliberate way, not to reduce uncertainty, but to maximize uncertainty and therefore strengthen the adaptability of people working in such environment. And in the long run, this organization outperformed the other bank. So what I'm trying to say is that it's not about, a training program. It's about actually the culture we create, the conditions that we design in organizations every single day, where we are choosing either to, reduce uncertainty, and provide all the answers. We're actually building the muscle of having to be resourceful and having to lead through ambiguity, having to, find the answers yourself, having to connect with different colleagues so you come with a better answer, right?
Mm.
So that is a different type of premise, right? It hasn't have even to do with the L&D department. It has to do with a different type of culture that you create. So, those organizations are the ones that are going to stand out, in the future because they already have the conditions inside themselves that basically replicate the external environment rather than trying to protect against it.
Wow, I think that's a perfect full circle moment, I think, on which to end. And for me, one of the things is the important thing around messy individuals, humans can be messy, but that can be a strength. And that's something that we could design for in organizations. So love it. So, Lucrecia, it's been amazing to have this conversation. I think I could be going on for much longer. Uh, and I did have a series of questions that I didn't get through, but very rich conversation. Perhaps we do a sequel at some point, but
Would
it was
love that.
lovely to talk to you.
Thank you so much. Thank you.